Hi, I'm Dr. Chad Larson. Thanks for joining me in another episode of Keep It Real. So today I'm going to introduce you to a couple new terms or phrases. The first term or the first phrase is time-restricted feeding, or we might also call it time-restricted eating. And that leads to the second phrase, which is unintentional dietary modification. And these are mostly used by researchers to evaluate a certain thing, which I'll get to in just a moment. But I'll just briefly describe what they are, and then I'll mention a study that was just published, and I'll tell you the outcome of the study and how it relates to you. So the first term is time-restricted feeding or time-restricted eating. And basically what this speaks to is eating foods during a certain period of time. And I'll go more into that in just a moment. But it's having, instead of just eating, any time of the day, all day long, there's a kind of a compressed eating window. And I'll talk about the amount of restriction that was put in this particular study. And then that leads to the second phrase, which is unintentional dietary modification. In other words, the first thing, which we'll get to in just a moment, the compressed eating window or the time-restricted feeding, causes an unintentional change to people's diets. And so here's the way that researchers evaluated this. This was published in a journal called Journal of Nutritional Science, and it was a university study out of the UK. And here's what they did, and this was just published just like days ago. So here's what they did, is they wanted to evaluate this time-restricted feeding and see how that changes different markers of human physiology. And so what they did is pretty basic, is they separated the subjects into two groups. One was the control group. They made no changes at all to their diet or lifestyle or anything else, just a control group. In other words, nothing changed with them. And the second group, in the time-restricted feeding group, here's what they did, is they only changed one basic variable. And all they did is they influenced the way that they ate their meals. And so what they did was they restricted the subjects that had the time-restricted feeding. They ate 1.5, in other words, 1.5 hours or 90 minutes later than they typically would. So in other words, if they typically eat breakfast at 7 a.m., they would eat breakfast at 8:30 instead. And they did the same thing at night. Instead of eating at, let's say, 8 o'clock at night, they ate earlier at 6:30. So they basically affected both ends of the day. Eat breakfast a little bit later, eat dinner a little bit earlier by 90 minutes. So that caused a slightly compressed eating window by 3 hours potentially. And so that's all they did. And then they evaluated multiple things, and this was a 10-week study. So for 10 weeks, the subjects that were part of the time-restricted feeding group ate their breakfast an hour and a half later than typical, and they ate their dinner an hour and a half earlier than typical. And this is all they did to the protocol. And then they measured multiple outcomes to see what kind of things changed. And something pretty profound changed. When they measured multiple things like their body weight and just other blood markers of blood sugar metabolism and cardiovascular risk factor markers. There really wasn't that much change in this period of time of glucose metabolism, of cardiovascular risk factor markers. The researchers stated that they were a little bit better in the time-restricted group, but statistically it was not real significant, so they didn't report all the details on it. But there was something that was pretty profound and interesting, and that was there was a significant drop of body fat percentage. So they evaluated not only the weight scale, but they also evaluated body composition. And what was interesting about this is that the weight scale did not change significantly. But fortunately, they also evaluated body composition. And every single subject who were on the time-restricted feeding group all had a significant drop of body fat percentage. So you go, wow, if they drop their body fat percentage, wouldn't that also drop the weight scale? This is what we don't like about the weight scale. The weight scale can be very, very misleading. If you gain 2 pounds of lean muscle and at the same time you lose 2 pounds of fat, the weight scale is going to say exactly the same thing. So, but that's a major, major health change in your body composition to lose 2 pounds of fat and gain 2 pounds of muscle. But the weight scale does not reflect that. So fortunately, they evaluated body composition, and there was on average a 1.9% drop of body fat percentage in 10 weeks, which is a really, really significant thing. And guess what? They did nothing with their diet, at least nothing intentionally, and that I'll get to in just a moment. There was no suggestion to eat certain foods. There was no suggestion to restrict calories or eat more calories. They didn't change anything. They gave no suggestions about diet whatsoever. All they did is they had the subjects eat breakfast 90 minutes later than typical and eat dinner 90 minutes earlier than typical. That's it. But to lead to that other phrase that we mentioned at the beginning, the unintentional dietary modification, what they found after they collected all the diet diaries from the subjects who were following the time-restricted eating, is that there was an unintentional dramatic decrease in overall caloric intake. So that's what they meant by unintentional, that it wasn't part of the study design to have them drop calories, but that's in fact what happened. And the subjects cited different things in a post-study survey, like they just didn't have the same amount of time in the morning to eat the breakfast, or they just weren't as hungry as they usually were. There was a variety of reasons, but that's what the researchers really wanted to evaluate, is what happens in this time-restricted eating window. And so that was very interesting. By creating this very mild, unintentional caloric deficit, there is a significant decrease of overall body fat percentage. And again, the weight scale didn't change. I can't overemphasize this. And so what that implies is they actually had an increase of lean muscle mass, because there was a decrease in body fat percentage, but the weight scale stayed the same. And so something else was allowing them to maintain normal body weight, even though they dropped 1.9% of body fat. So that's a really significant change, just making that one very, very minor change to their eating window. And so just to summarize, the two new terms that maybe you've heard of before, but there might be new terms for you: time-restricted eating. In the study, they call it time-restricted feeding. When I hear the word feeding, I think of like livestock or like animals or something. So I call it time-restricted eating, and time-restricted eating leads to unintentional dietary modifications, because having that just a little bit of a change in the rhythm that you're consuming food causes a very natural and unintentional caloric deficit, which leads to significant body fat percentage loss. So these are just very basic changes. Oftentimes people are looking for some huge dramatic change to burn fat, and just making a little bit of change, not even focusing on your calories or the foods that you're consuming, just changing the way that the timing of your eating. And some people, there's a lot of, I've even done past episodes on another term called intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting is where it's synonymous with time-restricted feeding, and basically it just means that there's kind of an extended period before you consume your first meal of the day, and that's basically intermittent fasting. I've talked about 12-hour intermittent fasting, 14-hour, 16-hour intermittent fasting in past episodes, but it's really interesting to see this very recent study that really speaks to the idea with just a very mild, unintentional, and probably non-noticeable change to their dietary timing, to their meal timing, caused a significant drop in body fat percentage. So anyhow, I hope that was interesting and useful. Start playing around with this, experiment a little bit with yourself. This study length was 10 weeks. Try it for a period of time and see how it goes for you. So I hope that helps. I will continue to read the studies and bring you the information. Until then, keep it real.